Why I love Night of the Comet. Hello and welcome to another video. This time I want to talk to you about Night of the Comet, a cult classic mid-80s horror comedy that has stood the test of time and remains an absolute cult classic to this day. Now for those of you, and I want to talk about why I love it. Now for those of you unaware, Night of the Comet is a 1985 comedy horror starring Catherine Mary Stewart, Kelly Maroney, and Robert Beltran. Beltran, otherwise most famous for being Chakotay in Star Trek Voyager, obviously. The plot basically is... it's an end-of-the-world movie mixed with a zombie movie, but it's not a zombie apocalypse as such. Basically, this comet kind of comes by into Earth's atmosphere, and basically anyone who kind of looks at it or is outside, essentially, or in unprotected areas, when it does, they basically either get immediately turned to dust or something worse. And it follows these two sisters, these two valley girls, who wake up the next morning because they basically slept through the whole thing, oblivious, in a couple of different locations, and they wake up to seemingly find that they're the only people left alive in the entire world. As it turns out, that's not true. There are some other survivors, one of whom is Robert Beltran. However, some of the other survivors were not quite as lucky as those three, and basically the effects of the comet are turning them into mindless zombies. There's also some mad scientists thrown in for good measure, as is always the case in post-apocalypse movies. Not all of your fellow survivors may necessarily be friendly, and that's very much the case in Night of the Comet. I think what sets Night of the Comet apart from many movies is its sense of humor and its sense of fun. This is a movie that knows exactly what it is and does not take itself too seriously. Its lead protagonists being these kind of seemingly stereotypical valley girls, except both of them are, particularly Catherine Mary Stewart, are a lot tougher and smarter than most people would initially give them credit for. I first saw Night of the Comet it would have been the late 80s or the very early 90s when it was shown on BBC Two in the UK. I remember watching that and absolutely loved it at the time. It was one of those movies that my brother had a kind of a pirate copy of in the 90s, because I didn't really have much of a VHS collection in the 90s of movies. I primarily had TV, because I started out kind of collecting Doctor Who, and then in the 90s I would tape loads of shit off the TV, like the X-Files and Seinfeld, and later on Buffy, etc. So I didn't really have much in the way of VHS movies, but my brother had an extensive collection, primarily pirated from the video shop. Shh. When the 2000s hit, though, and I got into DVD after he'd moved out as well, I started getting a movie collection, and Night of the Comet was one of the 80s movies that I picked up, because while I was, I'd say most of the heavy focus on my initial DVD collection was like more recent movies, like 90s stuff that I was into at the time. I was still picking up some of the 80s classics that I remembered from later on, like Ghostbusters and Gremlins and Indiana Jones, etc., etc. And Night of the Comet was one of the lesser known ones, but it was still one that I remembered fondly, and I wanted my own copy of. I have since upgraded to the Blu-ray in the 2010s, which looks beautiful. I think it's gotten a 4K recently, but yeah, I'm not doing the 4K thing. Not really. I've got a couple of... I got like Halloween 4, and that was mainly because the sound on the Blu-ray was fucked. So I got another copy of it, and it was better. It was a better picture. It was a good quality picture, but I don't even have a 4K player, let alone a 4K TV. I got it for the kind of the 4K scan on the Blu-ray, so I'm not really bothering with 4K. If I ever do, which I doubt, but if I ever do, I'd certainly consider Night of the Comet because it is still one of my absolute favourite movies. This is, again, this is one of those, even though I wouldn't necessarily say it was my childhood, my teens more like, this is one of those movies that has just stood the test of time for decades in my house. And it's one that you just kind of like more every time you see it. Initially, Jeffrey Lewis is also in this movie. I say initially, the only actors that I knew in it were Jeffrey Lewis, who's been in tons of stuff, of course, including as Blade Runner and the Any Which Way But Loose movies with Clint Eastwood and the orangutan. But many of these actors kind of familiar now. I think Catherine Mary Stewart's been in. I can't remember any other movies with her in. I think she did like some like the nighttime soaps and stuff like that. Robert Beltran obviously went on to Star Trek. Mary Woronov is also in this as one of the scientists. She has a small role in Warlock, which is another cult classic I may talk about sometime, and she's kind of a cult actress figure. Kelly Maroney, for a long time, I didn't know that Kelly Maroney was something of a mid-80s kind of a scream queen, because this was the only thing I'd ever seen her in for a really, really long time, up until the last couple of years, when I've seen a couple of her other movies in Shopping Mall, which is the killer security robots in a shopping mall. Great dumb fun. And the kind of the slasher movie, the Zero Boys, which is a bit of a subversion of the slasher in the cabin in the woods youths that the killers are going after, are a bit more kind of with it and a bit more survival oriented than most slasher movies. That it kind of turns into like an action horror rather than just a straight slasher. I'd never even heard of either of them up until the last few years, let alone seen them. So I've kind of discovered that Kelly Maroney was in more stuff than I knew. There you go. But yeah, I am not alone in loving Night of the Comet. It is one of those movies that horror fans, especially 80s horror fans, always hold in high esteem. I regard it as an absolute classic, up there with the likes of Return of the Living Dead, the original. And it's one of my favourite 80s horror classics. And that's why I love Night of the Comet.